Okay. There you go. That's you.
Oh.
Hello, everyone. You look delightful.
How's your tummy feel today?
Generally pretty decent. When I sit up and get ready to go for a walk, I usually have some just pangs of pain.
Like cramping?
Just like a crampy pain, I guess, but
Okay.
usually it subsides as soon as I'm standing up for 10 or 15 seconds. Trying to figure out what's going on with all the inputs and outputs, basically, within my system. I do have some occasional cramping in the abdomen. It seems to feel better if I put a hand on it, a little
Okay.
pressure. What's really at the key of my concerns right now, last evening, after days of acceptable but minimal stoma output, a couple hundred milliliters a day, between roughly 9:30 and 11:30,
Last
two
night?
2.5 hours last night, I put out 250, and I was like, wow, I feel like maybe that's because the small bowel has kicked
Starting
in.
to move?
It's ready to go. It has declined, and it's been smaller and smaller output right now, and I'll
Okay.
show you. Take a quick look. Thank you.
Okay. When you came in, did your tummy feel bloated?
Yeah.
It was distended. Does
I
it?
felt like it did, and it bloated differently because of air versus the liquid contents that have just been
Okay.
building up and building up
Okay.
over the several days.
Does it? Does it feel less bloated now than when you came in?
So yes, yeah.
Okay. Small bowel's probably still distended just because for you not to have your tummy even flatter than this, the small bowel would have to be still distended, I think, although it's fairly soft, but we took such a huge colon out of there. I would
I
expect,
mean, there's a fair amount of pizza
Well,
going
there's
on
that,
right here
but-
too.
but I don't think it's gone down quite as much as I would expect it to if it had completely resolved and the small bowel was back down to its normal size.
So one of the things that Dr. Kidwell mentioned, I think a day or two ago, was the desired output and look and feel. And this is pretty close, but I see now that there's a lot more like yellowy white, just mucus look. I mean,
But
even
you've
around the
also got
stoma.
you've also got some thicker bits in there.
Yeah, and so when I put out the 250 roughly, it was all this just greenish brown, relatively thin liquid, which I recall you said that was kind of the goal, like what we were going for. So I was like, okay, maybe that's great. Maybe it's exactly what we're looking for. What I'm wondering is, could we be at a point where my stomach is generally pretty empty and anything it does create gets sucked up by the NG tube, and there just isn't very much remaining in an otherwise pretty empty small bowel?
The stomach does make some stuff, but even when that's not going through, and typically with the stomach, when the stomach starts emptying properly, it wouldn't be sucking this much out. So I see what you're saying. Maybe the tube is catching everything before it leaves the stomach. It doesn't quite work like that because the small intestine also makes that you've got other intestinal juices being put in there. So I don't think it's not putting out because the stomach suction has dried everything up.
Okay.
But I see what you're getting at. That's a good question. I wonder if it's worth trying to put a red rubber catheter in,
We can try.
because we did have that.
We had that initially. Be very happy to do that.
Yeah. Just to make sure that it's not kinking under the muscle layer there. When you came in, you had enough going on with altered electrolytes and altered kidney function and everything, that it could just be what we call an ileus, where the small bowel goes on strike, both after an operation and when you've got electrolyte abnormalities. But I think at this point, given how much your tummy's come down, it's still not pretty much out, is we could try putting a catheter in the stoma just to make sure it's not right under the abdominal wall.
Fine.
The other thing that we will do, starting tomorrow, because we
It's
put
after
the
10
order,
p.m.
yeah, the orders go in like in the earlier in the day, and then we get that stuff at night, but is to get you started on some intravenous feeding.
Okay.
Unless for some reason everything suddenly opens up overnight. Okay. But that involves putting like a long IV in the arm and threading it up to one of the major veins, so that we can put the intravenous feeding in there.
Okay. If you think so.
Keep your nutrition up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Get like a 20 French or something, red rubber catheter, and we'll see what that does.
So here's another question
Yes.
regarding dehydration
Yeah.
and urine output.
Mm-hmm.
We seem to be putting a lot of fluid in by all measures, and yet I don't seem to be seeing my uh, urine output changing in terms of lightening to a straw color.
So it's what goes in, we can measure. What comes out includes what's in the NG tube and what's in the stoma and urine. And you also got extremely dry, so there was also some catching up to do.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still going at a reasonable clip here and getting additional boluses.
Mm-hmm.
If your weight is staying roughly steady or just going up by a small amount, say a pound in a day, that's hydration. If your weight were to go up 4 pounds, then we're overhydrating you. If it were to drop, then we're underhydrating you, but a daily weight is helpful with that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember what you were this morning?
Yeah, I've hovered around the 202 pound mark.
Okay.
It was slightly lower. I'm totally okay with just pumping me through as much liquid as we can.
The difficulty with that is if we do too much all in one go, your body doesn't hold on to it and it gets into the surrounding tissues,
Mm-hmm.
because if you put a lot in, it drops what's called the oncotic pressure in the blood and you start to leak proteins, or rather not so much you dilute the proteins and you start to leak fluids into the surrounding tissues. So it's once you start putting fluid into the surrounding tissues rather than keeping it in the blood system, it's only when it's in the blood system that it gets filtered through the kidneys. So it's a balance between keeping up with your hydration and not swamping you and again affecting your electrolytes by giving you too much in one go, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Do we always use just plain saline, or do we ever use saline with other things in it?
No, we often use, like, depending on what your electrolytes look like, sometimes we use half normal with potassium in it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we use lactated ringers.
Okay. Is lactated ringers, is that the one that has like sugars in it?
No, when we add sugar to, sugar's another one, like D5 half normal that we use for hydrating. But typically when you're behind and a lot of, you've vomited or we think you've sucked a lot of fluid into the gut, like when it's blocked, we'll often go for the normal saline, because the salt in that actually helps you hold fluid in the vascular system.
Okay. All right, so short term, the couple of tweaks that we'll make is to put in the Red Robin,
Right. Yep.
see if that helps with any kind of output.
And TPN, that's the intravenous.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's an ileus or a small bowel obstruction, most of these resolve. Ileus, we don't use surgery for, that's just waiting for the bowel to wake up. A bowel obstruction, rarely nowadays. It used to be up to 30% of people who used to have to go to the OR with it. But now, probably with laparoscopy, the risk of adhesions is so much less that we rarely have to go to the operating room for it.
How about, would it just be absolutely crazy, or why would it be a bad idea for me to stop the NG tube suction and drink some grape juice or whatever?
Sometimes we do that because sometimes when the bowel function is returning and people are getting rid of all that fluid that's been sitting in the bowel, the stomach and the G-tube can sometimes act like a third kidney and get rid of extra fluid like that. But first of all, I don't mind trying that, but first of all I want to get a tube, a red rubber catheter in the stoma, maybe see what that does overnight, and then if the amount coming out of the NG tube is less in the morning, we can consider a clamping trial, where we just take it off suction and then 3 hours later we check and see how much is in the stomach.
And is the clamping trial including or different from the idea of, is that what you're saying, like would you drink fluids?
No, because if you're not ready to accept fluids, we don't want to both take it off suction and be challenging what's in your stomach. We want to get an idea of how well your stomach is emptying by taking this off suction and letting the stomach empty out what it can.
Sure.
So we wouldn't want to challenge it with extra fluid because that will mess up how we estimate the emptying of it.
Okay, that makes sense. What's your take on to what degree I should be eating any ice? And what do you think about putting ice in my mouth, swishing it around, and spitting it out?
You can have the ice cubes are for comfort.
Mhm.
Now, sometimes we find people who manage to guzzle a litre or more of ice cubes, which is not a good idea because then it falsely elevates what's coming out of the NG tube.
Mhm.
So they're for comfort for when your mouth gets dry, but you don't have to spit it out unless you're going up through cup after cup of it.
Another one thing I was wondering is if I've got this NG tube that's kind of irritating the back of my throat and making a viscous saliva, is that part of what's not only going into the stomach, but also using up some of the fluid in my system?
There's no evidence that that would be a significant portion of the
Okay.
fluids in the gut.
Okay.
But good question. I haven't been asked that one before, but
Hmm.
it might feel that you're swallowing a lot of stuff, but relative to what's sitting in your gut or coming out of the NG or coming out of the stoma or not coming out of it, that's going to be a very, very small percentage.
What kinds of stomach-based pain or nausea or other sensations should I expect depending on what might be underlying?
Both ileus and small bowel obstruction cause cramping. Ileus is said to result in a silent abdomen. That's not always true because you can still hear dripping sounds. So I don't find that listening to the abdomen is helpful. It's if the small bowel is dilated down to a point and then there's decompressed bowel before the stoma, then we can say, oh, there's an obstruction that's not at the stoma level. But when the bowel is dilated all the way down to the stoma, it can be ileus or obstruction.
Is there a cause to do any additional scanning?
Not at this point, no.
Okay.
We know it's not resolved because you're not having a normal amount out of the ileostomy. And so putting you through another scan right now is really just giving you extra radiation for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing we could also do in the morning, if there's not a big difference with the tube, is actually give some gastrographin through the NG tube because sometimes that can propel stuff through.
What's gastrograph?
It's the stuff that's diluted that's used in CAT scans. But sometimes if it is a bowel obstruction, it could be used to hasten the resolution of the obstruction.
Okay. All right. Is that on your list? Is that on your list, your radar, if we need that for tomorrow?
Gastrographin in the morning, if we'll see. Let's just see what comes out of the NG and then I'll round with you in the morning and then we'll make that decision.
We'll get the measurements of what's going on and then we'll talk to the doctor.
Does it make any difference what position I'm in? Vertical or horizontal? Left side, middle, right?
No, small bowel goes in all directions. It gets pushed through by propulsion,
Also scan.
contraction, not by gravity.
Okay. All right.
Good questions.
Well, I'm trying to think through what's going on. I was so excited last night. I really thought we'd turned the corner.
Yeah.
We'll make sure we know about TPN.
All right, hon. So I'll leave the light on for the guys when they come back with a red rubber catheter.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This will get better. I
All
promise.
right.